Genesis 15, 1 through 21. Not going to read it all at the beginning. We'll just jump into it and start using the story arc at the end to kind of just break down the text. So here we go. It begins with, after this, the word of the Lord came to Abram in a vision. We should immediately just say, what happened? After this, after what? And the answer is after Genesis chapter 14, right? Where Abram went into battle against Kedor Laomer and came out victorious, worshipped God through the high priest Melchizedek, and gave everything back to the Lord, right? After this, after these events, and we don't know if they're right after or years after, the amount of time, the passage of time isn't as important as the event itself and its relation to this particular blessing. So the word of the Lord comes to Abram in a vision. So he's seeing this. The first thing is, do not be afraid, Abram. And again, we would ask ourselves, why? Why should Abram not be afraid? And maybe it's because when people see God, usually they're terrified. Maybe it's because Abram's dealing with fear. We don't really know. But there are two parts to this blessing from the Lord, or this word from the Lord. And the first is this: I am your great shield, I am your shield, which coming out of the battle with Kedorlaomer is great news, right? Like, it's something that Abram knows, but now it's even further reinforced. God himself has shown up to Abram and said, I am your shield. And then number two is your very great reward. This is the literal literal translation of the words in the Hebrew. And then this way, the NIV is actually kind of superior to the NASB or the ESV in terms of being literal. Usually the ESV and the NASB are more literal, but in this case, the NIV is. And the question that this particular translation leaves us wondering is God, I am your very great reward? Is that what he's saying? Or is he saying your reward is very great? So is there a is that's missing? And that's the question that many people ask. This option of your reward is very great makes more sense of what is to follow. And the other one, the idea that God is his very great reward, is also true theologically, right? And it makes sense when we think about the fact that Abram walked away from the battle with Kedorlaomer without a reward. For God to come up and say, I am your very great reward, makes more sense of chapter 14, whereas the other version where it says your reward is very great makes more sense of the rest of 15. You can take it whichever way you like. We'll probably go with your reward is very great going forward. But anyways, let's just take this, and that is the starting action. That's verse 1. Okay. Oh, where'd it go? There it is. All right. So verse 1, God appears and blesses, right? Gives this two-part kind of blessing to Abram. And let's go back up and see what happens next. The first word that we get is but. So Abram's about to kind of, I'm not going to say talk back to the Lord, but you're going to see Abram really struggle with the Lord for the first time in this whole story. But Abram said, Sovereign Lord, what can you give me since I remain childless, and the one who will inherit my estate is Eliezer of Damascus? And Abram said, You've given me no children, so a servant in my household will be my heir. So back to this statement up here, your very great reward. This seems to align with the translation, which would be your reward is very great. And in this way, the NASB, the NASB, the ESV translate it that way. And basically, God says, your reward's going to be great, Abram. But Abram says, how is this going to be since I remain childless and the one who will inherit my estate is Eliezer of Damascus? And Abram said, right, not just once, You've given me no children, so a servant, well, in my house will be an heir. So this statement gets repeated. It's the same thing. It's the same statement, right? Abram doesn't have any children still, and a servant, Eliezer of Damascus, will be the one that inherits the household, right? So that's kind of the driving action here. So verses, I think it was verses 2 and 3, verses 2 through 3. Abram has no kids and voices concerns to God, right? And we're about to learn about God here. What does God do when we come to him struggling with belief, struggling with doubt? It's important to remember that this happens after the events of chapter 14. After the mountain high for Abram comes the valley low. And that's what we begin to see here, that Abram is in a valley of doubt. And it's because he's been years in the promised land, still no kid. Then the word of the Lord came to him. This man will not be your heir, but a son who is your own flesh and blood will be your heir. So verse 4. God promises Abram a flesh and blood son. And then we'll see in a second, I'm just going to write it right here, verse 5, stars. Okay? Let's go back up. He took him outside and said, look up at the sky. It's the first command of the text. Just look up, Abram. Look up at the sky and count the stars. It's the second one. If indeed you can count them. Then he said to him, so shall your offspring be. So Abram's dealing with doubt. And the way that God encourages Abram is profound. He just says, go outside and look up at the sky and count the stars. And I remember I grew up in Alaska. And I remember when I looked at the sky in Alaska, there's a lot less light pollution, and you couldn't count the stars. And that's where Abram's at right now. He looks up at the sky, and there's too many to count. He says, so shall your offspring be. And here's the high point of the first climax of the story. Abram believed the Lord, and he credited him as righteousness. This is, in my view, the second most important verse in the Old Testament. That's my personal opinion. Abram believed the Lord. He looked at the stars and he heard the promise, so shall your offspring be, and he believed the Lord. And what did God do in response? God credited it to him as righteousness. The problem of sin, which began in chapter 3 of Genesis, has now been solved in chapter 15. Believing the Lord and receiving righteousness as a result. This, in the story we are reading today, verse 6, faith, righteousness, right? Faith is not equal to righteousness. Faith is credited righteousness. Abram is made righteous before the Lord by faith. This is critically important. You can go read Romans 3 and 4, and you'll understand that Abram's being justified by faith is the basis for which Christians can be credited righteousness for our faith. We have faith in a promise as well that Jesus was the Son of God, that he did die for our sins and rose again on the third day and ascended into heaven, that he is Lord. And when we believe that in faith, God credits to our account the righteousness of Christ. And verse 6 of Romans 15 is what makes that possible. In our story, it is the lesser climax. But if we were looking at, like redemptive history as a whole, you kind of have this peak at the fall. You have this peak at the flood. You have this huge peak when Abram becomes righteous by faith. And then you have like Israel and all that stuff. And then Jesus again. But this is a monumental moment in the Old Testament. All right, we'll continue. Verse 7. He also said to him, I am the Lord who brought you out of Ur of the Chaldeans to give you this land and to take possession of it. But Abram said, Sovereign Lord, how can I know that I'll gain possession of it? So let's go back down. Oops, sorry. So I am the Lord who brought you out of Ur of the Chaldeans, that was his homeland, to give you this land and take possession of it. So here, the issue was an heir. And now, this issue is the land. The second part of the promise that God has given to Abraham. So Abram says, Sovereign Lord, how can I know that I will gain possession of it? Even though he has faith here in the promise of a son, he's wondering, how can I know? How can I be sure that I will gain possession of it? Abram's still dealing with doubt, right? So let's go to verse 7. Down here, that's kind of this whole thing is kind of like verse 7. Following action, God reaffirms promise of land. And in that way, verse 7 mirrors verse 1, right? And then verse 8, right? Abram doubts again. Some commentators think that Abram's not really operating on doubt here, but I think that that's the kind of overriding theme of this chapter. And God does not really chastise Abram for his doubt in this moment. He understands Abram's situation. Abram's been in the land for years. He's not gained possession of anything, and he has no child. So, what does God do? The Lord said to him, Bring me a heifer, a goat, a ram, each 3 years old, along with a dove and a young pigeon. The thought here about 3 years is that this was probably the highest value of these animals here. And then also bring a dove and a young pigeon, which equals 5 animals total. Verse 9. Oops. All right. Waiting for that to come back. Okay. Verse 9. Bring animals. And there are 2 possible significances of these animals. One is sacrifice, and the other is covenant or promise. And we'll see here in a second that Abraham seems implicitly to understand that this is covenant, that these are covenant animals because of his actions, right? So that's, by the way, the second command of this main text. Bring me these animals. Abram brought all these animals to him, cut them in 2, and arranged the halves opposite each other. Now, this isn't an explicit command from the Lord. Maybe God did say it and it just wasn't written down. Or maybe God picked animals and Abram implicitly knew what to do with them because they were culturally significant. Either way, he cuts the animals in 2 and arranges the halves opposite each other. The birds, however, he did not cut in half. Then the birds of prey come down on the carcasses, but Abram drove them away. This is a very important part of the story. So verses 10 through 11, Abram prepares and tries to protect. So, like, if we're just kind of following the story, obviously verses 1 through 6 took place at night, right? That was the time because there were stars out from verses 1 through 6. So he appears to Abram in a vision. That means Abram's having a dream at night. He can't really sleep. He's struggling. He starts voicing his complaints to God after God gives him his blessing. And God takes Abram outside, says, look up at the stars. And Abram believes God. It's been a good day, a good evening, at least a good night for Abram. But then there's this promise of the land. And it turns into the next day where now in the morning, we might assume, God tells him, go get all these animals. Go bring all of these animals to me. And verses 10 and 11, Abram does, right? He prepares the animals, he cuts them in half, And then throughout the day, he tries to protect them. He tries to keep the birds of prey from descending upon them. But if we look at what happens at the end of that, verse 12, as the sun was setting, it's been a whole day. We know that Abram didn't sleep much the night before. After a whole day of guarding these carcasses, Abram falls into a deep sleep. I'm going to go back to the bottom here, verse 12. And I'm just going to point out here that Abram's strength fails, right? He's unable to stay awake any longer, unable to protect these animals of the covenant. And at that point, a thick and dreadful darkness comes over him. This is the presence of God. And it being dreadful is not so surprising, but it being thick and dark is. Why would God's presence be this thick darkness? And it's because the promise that he's going to get. Abram wanted the answer to this promise up here. How can I know that I'll get possession of it? And that gets answered right down here in verses 13 through 16. You want to know, Abram? This is how you're going to know. And he gives him the prophecy. Know for certain. You want to know? Know for certain that for 400 years, your descendants, right, as numerous as the stars, will be strangers. They're going to continue to be foreigners for a long time in a country not their own, and that they will be enslaved and mistreated there. But I will punish the nation they serve as slaves, and afterward they will come out with great possessions. You, however, you will go to your ancestors in peace and be buried at a good old age. And in the 4th generation, your descendants will come back here, for the sin of the Amorites has not yet reached its full measure. God promises what's going to happen. He tells him the future. So God gives him the answer. Verses 13 through 16 is kind of the front end of the climax, verse 13 through 16. And what we get here is the prophecy. Abram gets to see the future, prophecy of the future. God starts it off with, know this for certain, right? And it's one of those things where Abram says, I want to know, and he gets the answer, and it's not all sunshine and roses. There's some sadness here. There's some real foreboding here. There's some real darkness here. Sometimes we ask God for answers, and maybe we don't really want the answer. And Abram's just learned that in verses 13 through 16. But God continues in verses 17 through 21. When the sun had set and darkness had fallen, a smoking fire pot with a blazing torch appeared and passed between the pieces. Whoops. And this is the big deal here. Now this is verses 17 through 18. God cuts a covenant. What we have here is at least a picture that it's likely that this is the way that they made covenants with one another. There's a document that we have that comes from a much later time, almost 1,000 years after Abram. But they would do this. They would cut animals, and they said, if I break this covenant, then may it be done to me as it was done to this animal. Now, that's 1,000 years after Abram, but the process is the same. And so it would seem that God is saying here, in some way, I am guaranteeing by passing between the pieces, as the smoking fire pot with the blazing torch, this is God right here. This is God's presence passing between the pieces, that God is invoking the covenant upon himself. This is my promise. When Abram says, how will I know? How can I know that I will gain possession of it? God says, I promise you this will happen. I'm cutting the covenant with you. This language comes from Jeremiah. It may have historical roots. It may have cultural roots. Whatever the case is, the name of this process becomes very clear. It is a covenant. It is a promise that God makes with Abram. So God cuts a covenant with Jeremiah. And then kind of the falling action is he also gets the specifics on the land he will inherit. And that's verses 18 through 20. To your descendants, I will give you this land from the Wadi of Egypt to the great river of the Euphrates. Now that's Egypt to Turkey. Now Israel, even under David, never owned this much land. They've never had this much land, which means that God is still working and will one day fulfill this promise because he is faithful. To the land of the Kenites, the Kenizzites, the Kadmonites, the Hittites, the Perizzites, the Rephaites, the Amorites, Canaanites, Gershites, Jebusites, all these groups from the Wadi of Egypt to the Euphrates, God will give to him. So now it's prophecy of land inherited. This is the arc of the story that we look at today. And what we get is this big lesson in, overall, there's this big lesson in God dealing with our doubts. That's the big lesson in terms of story, just for chapter 15. But if we were to think about all of the Bible, from Genesis all the way to Revelation, this story, which we call the meta-narrative, there's a bigger moment, a more important moment, and that is this, that we are justified. In other words, made righteous by faith. When someone asks, how were the Old Testament Israelites saved? You say, the same way we are saved. They were justified by faith. Abram believed he would have sons. And he was made righteous. The Israelites, they believed obedience to the law and animal sacrifices would take away sin. And although we know that the blood of bulls and goats can't take away sin, they're trusting that because God told them to do so, that he will therefore take away their sins. Not that the blood of bulls and goats is sufficient, but that because they have believed and obeyed, that God would take away, right? Now, we as Christians, we have this more fully. We know that the blood of bulls and goats can't, but the ultimate sacrifice has been given. Jesus, God's Son, died for our sins, rose again, and is Lord of all. 3 different promises. But each one of these 3 justified by faith. When God makes a promise and we believe it, in his economy, he is willing to credit to us righteousness, the righteousness of his Son. And for Abram, this is a mystery. How could God give me righteousness? For the Israelites, it's a little bit less of a mystery. We know that there's some sacrifice involved, some death involved, but the question's still there. How could goats and sheep and bulls take away our sin? But for Christians, it is fully revealed. Jesus is the ultimate sacrifice, and Jesus is the source of our righteousness. And when we believe in God and his promise, his gospel, he credits to us the righteousness of his Son, Jesus Christ. So we have the full picture. These guys did not, but that's okay. They believed and God justified them, and he does the same thing to us. And so when we look at all of redemption history, Genesis 15:6 is one of the biggest verses in all of the scripture, but it sits now in this other story of Genesis chapter 15 where God deals with our doubt, and we see that here by encouraging Abram in incredible ways. So I hope that this passage is a blessing to you, and that it just unpacks in your mind more of how we are saved by faith.